Ada Whitaker stood at the front of the church in her mother's linen dress, holding a small bunch of sage and wildflowers, and the room was full of people waiting for something that wasn't going to happen. The door at the back had opened twice in the last 10 minutes, each time admitting someone who wasn't the groom, and the second time the murmur that went through the pews sounded less like anticipation and more like pity taking shape. She kept her eyes on the window above the altar, where a wasp was working its way along the sill, methodical and unbothered, and she thought that was a good thing to watch, instead of faces. Reverend Marsh cleared his throat and looked at her the way a man looks at a horse with a broken leg, all sorrow and no solution. Ada set the flowers on the front pew, smoothed the front of her skirt once, and turned to face the room. She had known for an hour, maybe longer. A woman knows. The silence in the church was the kind that makes noise feel like mercy. She walked. Not quickly, not slowly. And stats. She kept her chin level, and her hands loose at her sides, and she did not look at anyone, which meant she did not see their faces doing the arithmetic of her humiliation. Halfway down the aisle, a child said something and was shushed. 3 rows from the back, a man stood up from the end of a pew and stepped into the aisle in front of her. His name was Silas Vance. She knew him the way she knew most men in town, which was to say, she knew he ran cattle on the far side of the valley, that he came into the mercantile once a month for supplies and paid in cash, that he didn't attend socials or linger after church, and that he had good horses. He was tall and square-shouldered, somewhere past 40, with gray starting at his temples, and the kind of hands that were clean but would never look soft. He was wearing a dark coat she had never seen him wear before, and a string tie, and when he looked at her, his face was calm. He offered his arm. Not with any ceremony, just held it out the way a man offers a hand to someone stepping down from a wagon. Ada looked at it, then at him. His eyes were steady. She took his arm, and he walked her the rest of the way out of the church and down the steps into the street, where the sun was bright and merciless, and the whole town could see them. He didn't say anything. He walked her 2 blocks to the boarding house, where she rented a room on the 2nd floor, and when they reached the door, he let go of her arm, touched the brim of his hat, and walked back the way they'd come. Ada went inside and up the stairs, and sat on the edge of her bed still wearing the linen dress, and for a long time she didn't move. Ada Whitaker had been raised by an aunt after her parents died of fever when she was 9. Aunt was a hard woman who believed in work and little else, and Ada had learned to sew fine seams and keep a house and ask for nothing. She was plain-faced and small and had no people and no money. And at 26, she had believed that a man offering marriage was the same as a man offering kindness. She had been wrong about that. Silas Vance had come to the valley 7 years earlier with a string of horses and a bill of sale for a section of land that nobody else had wanted. He had built a house and a barn and run cattle and kept to himself. He had been married once, a long time ago, to a woman who died in childbirth, along with the child, and he didn't talk about it. He was known as a fair man and a good hand with stock, and people left him alone, which seemed to be what he preferred. 3 days after the wedding that hadn't happened, Ada went back to work at the mercantile. She kept the accounts and measured yard goods and filled orders, and she did not look up when the bell over the door rang, unless she had to. The first person to speak to her about it was Mrs. Coyle, who ran the boarding house and had opinions about everything. "That Hargrove boy," Mrs. Coyle said, "always did have more nerve than sense running off the morning of his own wedding. His people are mortified." "I'm sure they are," Ada said. "Silas Vance did a kind thing. Walking you out like that gave people something else to talk about." "Yes," Ada said. Mrs. Coyle waited for more, didn't get it, and moved on. The second person was Silas himself. He came into the mercantile on a Saturday morning, set a list on the counter, and waited while Ada filled it. 50 pounds of flour, 20 of sugar, coffee, salt, a box of cartridges, 2 spools of wire, a jar of salve for harness sores. She wrote it all down and tallied it and told him the amount, and he paid and loaded the goods into his wagon. Before he left, he said, "I need someone to keep house, cooking, mending, that sort of thing. I can pay $20 a month, and found you interested." Ada looked at him. His face was exactly as calm as it had been in the church. "I have work here," she said. "I know it," he said. "Thought I'd ask." He touched his hat and left. Ada stood at the counter with the cash box open in front of her, and something turned over in her chest that she couldn't name. She thought about it for 2 days. She thought about the room at the boarding house, with its narrow bed and its window that looked onto the back of the laundry. She thought about the mercantile, and the measuring, and the small, careful questions people asked when they wanted to know if she was bearing up. She thought about Silas Vance's face in the church aisle, steady and without pity. On the 3rd day, she told Mr. Dunbar at the mercantile that she was giving notice, and she told Mrs. Coyle the same. And the following Monday, Silas came to town with the wagon and collected her and the trunk that held everything she owned. The house was small and square, built of milled lumber, with a stone chimney and a porch that faced east. There was a main room with a cook stove and a table, a bedroom off to one side, and a loft above reached by a ladder. Silas carried her trunk into the bedroom and said, "You'll take this one, I'll take the loft. There's a root cellar out back and a spring house down the hill. Chickens are yours to manage if you're willing. I'm up before light most days and I take breakfast at first light, supper when I come in, which is generally near dark. I'm not particular about what, long as there's enough of it." "All right," Ada said. "I'm gone most of the day." "You'll have the place to yourself." "All right." He looked at her for a moment, then nodded and went out. Ada stood in the bedroom and looked at the bed, which was narrow and neatly made, and the chest of drawers, which was empty, and the window, which looked out on a long sweep of valley and the mountains beyond. She unpacked her trunk and hung her 2 dresses on pegs and set her mother's Bible on the chest, and then she went to see about the chickens. The work was easy and the days were long. She learned the rhythm of the house, the way the stove drew, the place in the floor that creaked, the hour when the light came through the east window and made the table glow. She cooked and mended and kept the place clean, and Silas came in at dark and ate whatever she set in front of him, and thanked her and went up to the loft. He was not a man who talked much. He told her when he'd be gone longer than usual, and he told her when something needed fixing, and he told her once that the biscuits were good, and that was the extent of it. But she began to notice things. The wood box beside the stove was always full, though she never saw him fill it. The latch on the spring house door that had stuck was suddenly smooth. The chicken's fence, which had sagged, was tight and square one morning, without comment. A pair of good boots appeared beside the door, sized for her, and when she looked at Silas, he said, "Saw you needed them," and that was all. In town, people talked. Mrs. Coyle told Mrs. Prescott that Ada Whittaker had gone to keep house for Silas Vance, and wasn't that convenient? Mrs. Prescott said it was a practical arrangement, and probably for the best, given everything. Mr. Dunbar, who had hired Ada back when she was 18 and knew her to be steady, said he thought Silas Vance was a decent man and people ought to let it lie. His wife said that decency and intentions were 2 different things, and time would tell. At the mercantile, Mr. Aldrich, who freighted goods up from the rail line, said he'd seen Silas in town buying yard goods, which was a new development. The clerk said Silas had also bought 2 pounds of peppermints, which he'd never done before. Mrs. Coyle, who happened to be in the store, said peppermints were a courting sweet, and Mr. Aldrich said they were also just peppermints, and the argument went around until someone changed the subject. Ada found the peppermints in a tin on the shelf above the stove. She didn't say anything about them, and neither did Silas, but after supper he would set the tin on the table between them, and they would each take one and sit in the lamplight while he mended a bridle, or she hemmed a shirt. Became a habit. The tin emptied, and he brought another. and the evening settled into something that felt almost like companionship. By the second month, she had learned that he took his coffee black and strong, that he didn't care for beans, but would eat them without complaint, that he could whittle and sometimes did, leaving small wooden animals on the windowsill that he never mentioned. She learned that he rose in the dark and stood on the porch for a few minutes before he did anything else, looking out at the valley as though he were checking that it was still there. She learned that he was careful with the stock, that he gentled the horses instead of breaking them, and that he once rode 4 hours in a storm to bring back a calf that had wandered through a cut fence. She learned that he had a scar along his ribs from a bad fall years ago, because she saw it once when he came in to wash up and his shirt was off. He saw her see it and said, "Horse rolled on me. I was greener then." And that was all. In the spring, a man came to the house looking for Silas. His name was Hargrove, and he was the father of the man who had left Ada at the church. He was red-faced and blustering, and he said he wanted to speak to Ada, that his son had made a mistake and wanted to make things right, that a wedding could still be arranged if she was reasonable. Silas had been in the barn. He came across the yard and stood on the porch beside Ada, and he didn't say anything, just looked at Hargrove. The way a man looks at a snake he's deciding whether to shoot. Hargrove said, "This doesn't concern you, Vance." "It does," Silas said. "My son made an error in judgment. He's willing to do the honorable thing. He had his chance at that," Silas said. "He's got no business here now. Miss Whitaker ought to speak for herself." Silas looked at Ada. She looked back at him, then at Hargrove. "I have nothing to say to your son," she said. "You can tell him I'm spoken for." Hargrove blinked. "Spoken for? That's right," Silas said. Hargrove looked between them, his face going redder. "Well," he said, "well, I see how it is. I'll tell him he's had a narrow escape." Then he left. Silas watched him ride off, then looked down at Ada. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Meant what you said." She looked at him. His face was calm, but something in his eyes was not. "I did," she said. He nodded. "All right then." He went back to the barn. Ada stood on the porch and felt the thing in her chest that had turned over months ago turn again, and this time she knew what it was. That evening after supper, Silas didn't go up to the loft. He sat at the table and turned his coffee cup in his hands, and finally he said, "I'm not a young man. I'm not easy company. I've got no people and no prospects beyond what you see here, but I'm willing if you are." Ada looked at him. The lamp between them made his face into planes of light and shadow, and his hands on the cup were steady. "I'm willing," she said. They were married by Reverend Marsh on a Thursday morning with Mr. and Mrs. Dunbar as witnesses. Ada wore a blue dress she had sewn herself, and Silas wore the same dark coat he had worn the day he walked her out of the church. Afterward they went back to the house and Ada cooked supper, and Silas brought his things down from the loft. And that night he slept in the bedroom that had been hers and was now theirs. The town revised its opinion by accumulation, one sighting adding to the last. Silas was seen in the mercantile buying fabric. Ada was seen riding beside him in the wagon, sitting close. They were seen at church together, and at the Independence Day social, and once walking along the creek in the evening when the light was going soft. People decided that it was a practical arrangement that had become something else, or that it had been something else all along, and they had simply failed to notice. Either way, the talk died down, and the Vances were left to themselves. Years went by, the way years do. The house grew a second room, and then a third. A daughter was born, and then a son. The cattle herd grew. The valley filled in with new families, and the town got a railroad spur and a proper school. And Silas served on the school board, and Ada taught the children to read. They grew older together, their lives braiding into one another's the way water works at anything given enough time. When Silas was 67, he took a fever that the doctor couldn't turn, and he lay in the bedroom with Ada beside him, and the children grown and gone to their own places. He was quiet for a long time, And then he said, I saw you in that church, and I thought, there's a woman who deserves better. I didn't know I'd be the one to give it to her. You did, Ada said. I'm glad, he said. He died that night, easy and without struggle, and Ada sat with him until morning. She lived another 9 years in the house they had built together. She kept the chickens and the garden, and saw her grandchildren when they came to visit. On the shelf above the stove, there was still a tin of peppermints, though she was the only one who knew why. When she died, her daughter found a letter in the drawer of the chest in the bedroom, written in Silas's hand, on a piece of ledger paper. It was dated the week after Ada had come to keep house, and it said, I have no right to ask, but if you are ever willing, I am. It had never been sent. The daughter folded it carefully and put it back where she had found it, and later when she told the story to her own children, she said that some things are answered without ever being asked, and that was how it had been with her mother and father. The house still stands, and the tin is still on the shelf, and in the valley people still tell the story of the woman left at the altar and the quiet rancher who walked her out. Though by now the details have softened, and the truth has become something gentler than memory, which is what happens to all true things, given enough time.